They made France the epicenter of literature. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, McLeish, and others formed the Lost Generation. Their work influenced nearly every writer who followed. Their lives were among the most fascinating of the 20th century. During and after the First World War, some of America's best and brightest young artists made their way to Paris. They drank to excess, carried on illicit affairs, and occasionally found the discipline to write or paint. Tonight's biography is the story of this band of American intellectuals who spent the Jazz Age in the cafes and bistros of Paris. Gertrude Stein summed up her own situation this way: America is my country. Paris is my hometown. The same was true for the other poets, writers, and artists that became known as the Lost Generation. If you are lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, Ernest Hemingway wrote before he died, then wherever you go, for the rest of your life, it stays with you. For Paris is a movable feast. In the aftermath of World War I, Hemingway and other disillusioned young artists and writers flocked to Paris in search of artistic freedom. Immemorial place of inspiration, Paris in the 1920s was a city unsurpassed in its convergence of creative energy. Expatriate poets and novelists like Ezra Pound and James Joyce worked to reinvent literary form. F. Scott Fitzgerald created a voice for the new Jazz Age, while Ernest Hemingway pioneered a singular style of prose. Art devotee and literary godmother Gertrude Stein called this generation of renegade painters and writers lost. Ruthless, innovative, radically challenging Victorian convention. This lost generation would eventually produce the greatest concentration of art and literature in the 20th century. On the eve of World War I, American students of literature immersed themselves in the work of European masters with the hope of discovering their own artistic voice. These young writers, like Malcolm Cowley at Harvard University, had found little guidance among their fellow countrymen. The only authors to admire were foreign ones, Cowley concluded. It seemed to us that America was beneath the level of great fiction. As Cowley yearned for an American experience worthy of fiction, from across the Atlantic there came the seduction of grand events on the epic scale of authors Zola and Tolstoy.
The Lost Generation was a group of writers primarily, artists generally, who were educated on the values and virtues of European culture, a culture that largely existed in books. At the time of the First World War, when most of them were just coming into their maturity, they suddenly felt as though it was upon them to go and save that culture.
I must serve, Archibald MacLeish wrote his father, else I am not your son. MacLeish left his wife and children, his studies at Harvard, and a promising career at law to join in the war effort.
Archie didn't really need to go anyplace, but he felt called, and he was going to serve his country against the horrid people on the other side. So he signed up for the Yale ambulance unit.
The ambulance divisions throughout France and Italy were like college extension courses for a generation of writers, Cowley wrote. It provided us with fairly good food, a congenial occupation, furloughs to Paris, and uniforms that admitted us to the best hotels. Volunteer John Dos Passos was a product of New England prep schools and Harvard intellectuals. Born in Chicago, Illinois, he spent much of his childhood in Brussels and on tours of Europe with his family. But he yearned to experience the world outside of his privileged life. Dos Passos found a kindred spirit crossing paths with Ernest Hemingway, a boisterous teenager who joined the Red Cross ambulance unit to escape his Midwestern upbringing. Ambulance service was their way to get into the action, Dos Passos wrote, before the whole thing goes belly up.
They went and volunteered in various ways, and in that fashion saw the worst of the First World War, saw a Europe that had been destroyed. The morass of Passchendaele, the trenches, people who were disfigured by chemical warfare, mustard gas, and watching people get slaughtered by machine guns, sending cavalry up against tanks.
At Verdun, John Dos Passos saw countless dead and wounded in a battle of little strategic importance. In combat, Lieutenant Archibald McLeish reminded his men of President Woodrow Wilson's pledge to keep the world safe for democracy. McLeish was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. He was spared. His brother was not.
And they found his body in a farm in Belgium about 3 months after the war. And he was lying in full uniform, and there he was. And that destroyed Archie.
It was a generation that was lost in the carnage of World War I.
Those who went off to see the Europe of their treasured books were witness to its destruction. With the armistice on November 11th, 1918, the sons of America returned as men. President Wilson intended to keep the promise for which they fought. He envisioned America among a league of nations, leading through innovation and industry the means for future peace. But America was content to keep its prosperity at home.
There was a tendency to pull back and to believe that America, the United States, was really the seat of all that was good and everything else had to be excluded. There was an isolationist reaction to the war. They didn't want to join the League of Nations.
The idealist in McLeish was shocked by the Senate's refusal to join the League of Nations.
What came after the failure of the League of Nations and the return to banal, if you will, filled him with real rage. And I think it did Ernest, I know it did Dos, this sense that of betrayal, that this bloody, terrible war hadn't solved one damn thing.
In the 20s in the States, you had a culture that began to be repressive in various ways. You had the expansion of the Ku Klux Klan that starts its northward migration. You have an anti-labor movement that's really working to quash strikes. But you also have the beginnings of prohibition. This is a time where the country is run by Warren Harding or Calvin Coolidge, where the business of America is business.
As the Roaring Twenties began, bootleg liquor in speakeasies was not the only way to get a cheap thrill. There was the stock market, one which allowed a country to bet its future on selling short and riding the boom. As the country raced to make its fortunes, entertainments were fine, but little time could be wasted on art.
It's a country that sings itself songs like, "Yes, we have no bananas," and gets very excited about people going and sitting on flagpoles. In the face of that, there's this group who become progressively more disenchanted.
Ernest Hemingway returned to America with tales of combat, of romance in Milan with a beautiful nurse. But after the stories were told, Hemingway found himself back in the stagnant reality of Oak Park, Illinois. The difference in worlds left him lost in a haze of aimlessness, and his parents kicked him out of the house until he could find his way.
They came back to America after the war, very disillusioned, very confused, all wandered back to their various outbacks and found that nobody really understood what they had experienced. Nobody understood who they were.
At 17, we were disillusioned and weary. We had come to question almost everything we were taught at home and in school. Looking backward, I feel that our whole training was involuntarily directed toward destroying whatever roots we had in the soil, toward eradicating our local and regional peculiarities, toward making us homeless citizens of the world.
As former editor of the Harvard Law Review, Archibald MacLeish returned from the war to begin a profession at law. He had a family and a blossoming career, but little time to pursue his desire to write poetry. Walking home on a cold February night through the streets of Boston, Archibald MacLeish thought back to the dreams of his college days.
By the time he got home, it was very late, and Ada, I think, probably laid into him. They talked all night, and he said, look, I've got to do what I really feel called upon to do. Calling was very important to him. And what he was called upon to do, he felt, was to write poetry.
The next morning, MacLeish entered his law office with his decision.
He walked in, and there were all the senior partners of the law firm waiting, and Mr. Choate was just about to offer him a partnership. And he told him, I'm sorry, sir, I can't accept. I'm leaving the firm. He had the wisdom not to say at that time, I'm going to be a poet.
Supporting a family by poetry was a time-honored impossibility in America. But rumors from overseas reached MacLeish. In Paris, anything goes, and it was cheap.
His father, a very dour Scot, who had helped him in his undergraduate years, went ahead and helped him through the years in Paris.
The dollar was enormously strong. I mean, you could live on $100 a month easily in Paris in the 20s.
So they set off. 2 kids, a nanny, Ada and Archie, for Paris.
A generation who burned with the passion to create followed MacLeish. For the Ivy Leaguers, the chance to realize and live their dreams was too much of a temptation to resist.
They repacked their suitcases with civilian clothes and headed back to Paris for sojourns that lasted months and sometimes years, but they always intended to come back.
In steamers bound for France, a host of Americans left their country in search of their own artistic voices. A lost generation, unsure of its future, but certain that somehow it lay in Paris.
Paris was like a burst of sunlight when I came there. These wonderful boulevards, the Seine River winding around all over the place, and the church, Notre Dame, and the Sainte-Chapelle. I often think of the line that Wordsworth wrote and said, it was something to be alive, and to be young was very heaven. And this is in Paris.
You have to imagine, in Paris in the 20s, right after World War I, there had been a horrific cataclysm. Pretty much a whole generation had been wiped out in the war. And after something like that, there is a feeling of tremendous relief. It's kind of the reverse of survival guilt. It's survival celebration.
Man opens his eyes, takes a look, relaxes, and rediscovers life, gripped by a wild desire to dance, let off steam, scream, at long last stand upright, shout, and squander. described painter Fernand Léger.
Being young was enriching if you lived in Paris and you survived. It was sort of a great gasp of relief that we're now the world is safe and we can glory in it and enjoy it and feast on it.
In the decade following World War I, Paris exploded with life.
And this is Paris of the artist ball every year when everybody just broke all the rules.
Paris in the 1920s was a bohemia, and nothing represented its free spirit like the infamous artist balls, where revelers tried to keep both their wits and extravagant costumes about them during the course of the evening.
You had an amazing kind of polymorphous perversity in the social life. You had aristocrats who would have enormous costume balls at which, you know, half the people came in drag.
And the word is freedom, freedom, liberation, and do whatever you want and find yourself. And nobody will get in your way. You'll be respected for whatever you do, or you won't be chided. And this, from America, was quite a change.
You had Picasso and Braque and Léger reimagining how you would see things. You had Stravinsky and Ravel reimagining music. You had Cocteau and Gertrude Stein reimagining prose. It was a truly exciting time to be there.
Paris was where the 20th century was, remarked Gertrude Stein. Many who made it so passed through her salon on 27 Rue de Fleur. We were in those days, as I look back on them, constantly seeing people, Stein remembered of the war's end. John Dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, and a wave of American writers made Gertrude Stein's salon a mandatory stop for culture, conversation, and a taste of why they came to Paris.
And of course, Gertrude Stein's girlfriend, Alice B. Toklas, was a great cook.
From hosting Gertrude's friends in the Parisian avant-garde, Stein's lifelong companion was well experienced in the art of entertaining.
And she'd figured out that the way to keep the artists happy was to seat them opposite their own paintings. They never caught on that that's what she was doing, but they would sit there beaming through the whole meal because they'd be looking at their own work. So Picabia would be facing a Picabia and Picasso would be facing a Picasso. And that way they never quarreled with each other. Everybody was very happy.
As a guest in the salon of Gertrude Stein, the who's who of modern art were well fed in art and ideas.
Gertrude Stein is terribly important because whether you like her words or not, she influenced everybody.
Before she became the godmother of the expatriates, Gertrude Stein's celebrated life in Paris began under humbler beginnings. In 1904, she had left America behind, a failure in medical school.
She was in a severe depression. She'd had an unhappy love affair, which left her debilitated. She left New York, left America, not so much to find her freedom in Paris and to go explore the world, as to get away from a very painful situation.
Gertrude moved in with her brother, Leo Stein, arguably the century's most important collector of early modern art.
She and her brother started collecting all these important, scary, very ultra-modern paintings before anybody else. And they were hanging from the ceiling to the floor in the kind of what they call the Baroque style, where you just pile one painting right on top of another. And I think the furniture was quite kind of stuffy and old-fashioned and Victorian looking, which was in complete contrast to these extraordinary paintings.
On the walls of Leo Stein's apartment, portraits by Cézanne hung alongside the expressive colors of Matisse. Matisse frequented the home of the Steins and attended their Saturday salons, where he would join Georges Braque and other painters championed by Leo.
The French had a very old tradition of the salon. They were either artistic salons or strictly social salons or political. It usually was an institution that revolved around a woman who was sufficiently rich and had a big enough place that she could receive a lot of people. And then she would have her day. It would be like a Thursday. And everybody would show up and sit around and talk.
Her brother's latest discovery was a young Spaniard named Picasso. Gertrude observed a genius of very considerable magnitude. In Picasso, Gertrude found both an admirer and an inspiration for her experimental writing.
Gertrude Stein was very interested in Cubism because of Picasso, and so she was trying to create a verbal equivalent to Cubism in painting. Her idea was that if you talked about just the surface of a person or an object, that you would create this verbal Cubism.
If I told him, would he like it? Would he like it if I told him? Would he like it? Would Napoleon? Would Napoleon? Would he like it?
So it led to a kind of style like if Picasso, would Picasso, did Picasso. You know, there's all these sort of repetitious, incantatory phrases.
Would he like it if I told him? If I told him? If Napoleon?
The better-known work would be Picasso's portrait of Stein. After 90 sittings with Stein, an exasperated Picasso left her portrait unfinished, exclaiming, "When I look at you, I no longer see you." Finally, months later, he presented Stein with her completed portrait.
A famous line, she is said to have remarked, "It doesn't look like me." Picasso replies, "It will."
30 years later, Stein wrote, "It is the only reproduction of me which is still I."
Our image of that salon is that it is the beginning of true modernism. And of course, if you go to the modern collection in the Metropolitan Museum now, the first image you see, absolutely appropriately, is the Picasso portrait of Gertrude Stein.
As a literary hub for Americans in Paris, Stein's salon was surpassed only by the English-language bookshop on 12 Rue de l'Odéon.
And that was the bookshop of Sylvia Beach, Shakespeare and Company. And it became a literary center. It became a crossroads.
Sylvia Beach had a devotional love for literature and those who wrote it. Leaving her life in America as a minister's daughter, Beach opened her bookstore after wartime service as a Red Cross nurse. At Shakespeare and Company, Beach lent writers books and money. They used her store as their post office as they navigated their way through the flourishing scene of literary Paris. In a city which celebrated literature, a generation of American writers set off to take Paris as their own.
And I simply got my baptismal bath in it, as it were. I suddenly felt that I was part of this new movement. I had been writing before I knew this, but I know that it changed my writing. I know that, of course. You don't fight it, you belong with it, and you go with the stream.
Before, though, Paris was wonderful. Wanderers talking in all tongues from every country. Fame was what they wanted in that town. Fame could be found there, too, flushed like quail in the cool dawn, struck among statues, naked in hawthorn in the silver light.
Floods of artists from across the globe settled in Montparnasse on the left bank of the Seine. Marcel Duchamp called the convergence the first truly international colony of artists we ever had.
The interchange was just unbelievable. Everyone was involved in the arts, at least in the circles in which my parents moved, and it produced really extraordinary effects.
Paris was full of the young from Africa, from Eastern Europe, from Asia. The Swedes, the Norwegians, the Finns, the Latinos, remembered Archibald MacLeish. I think it is possible to say that they felt a kind of vacuum. The youth of Europe had been slaughtered. Among intellectuals like Tristan Tzara, the death of a generation implied the death of tradition. In a series of public statements, his Dada movement denied the existence of art altogether, often in pranks from followers like composer Erik Satie.
One story I vaguely remember about him was that he put up all these posters for a big performance that was going to be held. And of course everybody came, but the theater was dark, it was locked, it was a joke of his. And, you know, it was a performance they never forgot.
Liberated from tradition, artists in Paris sought a new beginning. Make it new, declared American poet Ezra Pound.
I think there was a sense of anything that you try to do may very well turn out to be the new field of expression.
Good art cannot be immoral, Pound wrote. By good art, I mean the art that bears true witness. I mean the art that is most precise.
In the 19-teens and 20s, the avant-garde was very much in the air. Everybody wanted to be up to date. Everyone wanted to be modern, and no one quite knew how to do it. And people who had tremendous self-assurance, like Pound, and a vast culture, like Pound, were ideally suited for leading the rest of the pack.
The eccentric Ezra Pound arrived in Paris in 1920 and quickly rose to become a leader of literary modernism. Pound was described as a philosopher of the crossroads grocery and Cracker Barrel. Born in Haley, Idaho, he enrolled in college at the age of 15 with the desire to find out what had been written and what was the best of it in as many languages as I could get.
He's interested, first of all, in translation. He translates the French troubadours into English. He translates the great poems of China, of the Tang and Sung dynasty. He learned Chinese. He was interested in Egyptian poetry and learned how to read hieroglyphics so he could translate that. I mean, he really had this enormous, all-engulfing thirst for world culture.
A jittery, restless individual who spoke in a drawl, wore a black velvet jacket, and donned a goatee, Pound became one of the most recognizable figures in literary Paris.
Of course, Ezra Pound is extremely famous, not only as a poet, but as kind of the godfather of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, having blue penciled that into a sharp, tight poem.
Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many I had not thought death had undone so many.
With haunting images of a sunken Ganga River, the falling cities of Europe, and dead soldiers crossing the London Bridge, The Wasteland evoked the emptiness felt by a generation living in the aftermath of war.
They were a lost generation, and they were making art in a kind of void, I think, and oftentimes as a sort of whistling in the dark.
For Americans writing in Paris, T.S. Eliot's poem was proof that great literature could come from among their own. The modern masterpiece had been created by a Midwesterner living in Paris. Complimenti you, bitch. I am racked by the 7 jealousies, Pound declared after reading Eliot's poem. A similar response came after Pound finished a chapter from another of his discoveries. Well, Mr. Joyce, I reckon you're a damn fine writer. That's what I reckon. After 7 years of 10-hour days and his eyes strained from a debilitating bout of glaucoma, Irishman James Joyce was nearing completion of his gargantuan novel, Ulysses. Yet his much-anticipated manuscript was effectively banned from American publication when a New York court judged a chapter obscene. Finding no commercial publishers willing to take the risk, Joyce eagerly accepted Sylvia Beach's offer to publish Ulysses through Shakespeare & Company. I give him everything I can spare, Beach wrote one financier. It is up to all of us who want the most important book of today to appear to come to the help of its author. Financing the task put constant pressure on Beach's small bookstore, notwithstanding Joyce's reckless personal spending. When funds were not available to complete the printing of the book, Beach charged admission to a staged reading of Ulysses.
Ladies and gentlemen, it seemed to me that I had been transported into a country far away from this country, into an age remote from this age, that I stood in ancient.
Yes. And his heart was going like mad, and yes. I said yes. I will. Yes.
Fervent applause by over 250 of the Parisian literati followed each section read that night. They realized, as Beach did, that the man who blushed before them had changed the course of modern fiction.
Oh, he was poor, obscure, no one had heard of him. Rolled on the floor with a pain in his eyes, and found fame he did. Ulysses, Yule Book, published to every people, even in Erse, and what became of him? Fame became of him.
Smuggling copies into America as the complete works of William Shakespeare, Sylvia Beach proudly placed her own copy of Ulysses in the window of Shakespeare and Company. As one customer saw it, it was displayed like the flag of freedom on the left bank. Another customer was drawn to the photographs of James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and other authors that lined the walls of her bookstore.
The photographs all looked like snapshots, and even the dead writers looked as though they had really been alive.
A newcomer to Paris and to his craft, young Ernest Hemingway had little idea his picture would one day hang among them. Sherwood Anderson was at a party in Chicago when he engaged the journalist Ernest Hemingway with tales about life in Paris. Hemingway knew Anderson's name well. The successful copywriter turned novelist had written Winesburg, Ohio, a novel hailed as an American classic. Inspiring the eager Hemingway onto a new life in Paris, Anderson provided advice on where to stay, what to eat, and whom to meet. Anderson wrote letters to friends in the Parisian avant-garde, introducing Hemingway as a young man of great talent, and in 1921, Hemingway and his new wife, Hadley, sailed for Paris. Eager to establish his literary connections, Hemingway brought his first letter to Sylvia Beach.
In those days, there was no money to buy books. I borrowed books from the rental library of Shakespeare and Company. On a cold, windswept street, this was a warm, cheerful place with a big stove in winter, tables and shelves of books, new books in the window, and photographs on the wall of famous writers, both dead and living.
Within the bookshelves of Shakespeare and Company, Hemingway's eyes opened to great literature through voracious reading of D.H. Lawrence, Chekhov, and the Russian novelists. He remembered that in Dostoevsky there were things so true that they changed you as you read them. And Tolstoy's War and Peace made the writing of Stephen Crane on the Civil War seem like the brilliant imagining of a sick boy who had never seen war.
To have come on all this new world of writing, with time to read in a city like Paris, where there was a way of living well and working, no matter how poor you were, was like having a great treasure given to you.
Hemingway's second letter of introduction was to a poet whose work was prominently displayed on the shelves of Shakespeare and Company. His first impression of Ezra Pound was that of a pompous bohemian, but in a show of restraint, Hemingway withheld his remarks in favor of friendship.
When he first came to France, Hemingway was more inclined to be a poet than an author. And so his early stuff was poetry, not very good poetry. Ezra was brutally honest in his relationship with these people. And he's the one who dissuaded Hemingway from writing any more poetry and to stay with the prose.
Under Pound, Hemingway learned the politics of literature, found an editor for his stories, and was taught that in writing to distrust adjectives, and in reading to keep to the French. To tell you the truth, he told Hemingway, I've never read the Russians. In return for his services, Hemingway taught Pound how to box, remarking how he leads with his chin and has the general grace of the crayfish. Pound would always remain a better writer than a boxer.
His own writing, when he would hit it right, was so perfect, and he was so sincere in his mistakes and so enamored of his errors and so kind to people that I always thought of him as sort of a saint. He was also irascible, but so perhaps have been many saints.
Hemingway used to say that Pound was about 50% right. When he was right, he was spot on. When he wasn't, it was so far off you could easily tell. And then quickly, Hemingway realized that there was another person who was responsive to a young writer's work, who was dead on almost all the time, and that was Gertrude Stein.
Armed with his final letter of introduction, Ernest Hemingway arrived at 27 Rue de Fleur to find it like one of the best rooms in the finest museum. He had a similar impression of its occupant.
Miss Stein was very big, but not tall, and was heavily built like a peasant woman. She had beautiful eyes and a strong German-Jewish face.
Gertrude Stein, I think, had enormous magnetism. She's like the Rock of Gibraltar. You feel this enormous strength of her body, of her massive head that was like the head of a Roman emperor, and you hear it in recordings in the timbre of her voice. So I think she had this magnificent presence.
Stein wrote that she liked Hemingway's talk and his passionately interested eyes. Like her relationship with Picasso, Stein relished in the role of a mentor to a younger artist. She assessed his short stories and passed judgment on his unfinished wartime novel.
And she said to him, begin again and concentrate this time. And I think she meant it in both senses of the word, of making it more concentrated and also pay attention to what you're doing.
And he realized he could learn from her. And she was watching the talent. She knew this was a talented man. It was very clear to her.
Stein convinced Hemingway to devote himself full-time to writing literature, telling him, if you keep on doing newspaper work, you will never see things. You will only see words. As their friendship developed, Stein criticized the lifestyle of Hemingway and his friends. She could not understand the excess of a generation given to frequenting cafes and, as she put it, drinking themselves to death. After a conversation with a Parisian hotel keeper on the subject, Gertrude Stein concluded that every man becomes civilized between the ages of 18 and 25. If he does not go through a civilizing experience at that time in his life, he will not be a civilized man. And the men who went to war at 18 missed the period of civilizing, and they could never be civilized. They were a lost generation.
They drink, they play about, they go here, they go there, they don't know where they're going, they don't know what they're doing. They live it up, but with no direction and no aim.
That's what you are. That's what you all are, Miss Stein said. All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation.
The Café du Dôme, the Café Rotonde, the Closerie des Lilas, les Deux Magots. You'd go to a cafe, you'd sit there, you'd talk, you'd think, you'd overhear conversations, and there was a certain electricity in the air.
Of the many cafes that dotted the left bank of Paris, Ernest Hemingway preferred the Closerie des Lilas, his adopted office for writing.
It was a pleasant cafe, warm and friendly, and I hung up my old waterproof on the coat rack to dry and put my worn and weathered felt hat on the rack above the bench and ordered a café au lait. The waiter brought it, and I took out a notebook from the pocket of the coat and a pencil and started to write.
I think that people spend an awful lot of time in cafes, partly because apartments are badly heated and badly lit. So all of them would go to these big cafes because they'd be well heated in the winter. There was always lots of light, and for the price of a cup of coffee or a brandy, you could stay there all day.
For the length of the morning until afternoon, Hemingway wrote his short stories, losing himself in the worlds he had known in America.
Hemingway, when it came to being a writer, was enormously disciplined. He would set himself a period of time and he would write and write and write, and he would tune out the world.
After writing a story, I was always empty and both sad and happy, as though I had made love, and I was sure this was a very good story, although I would not know truly how good until I read it over the next day.
Hemingway found Paris the town best organized for a writer to write in that there is, offering enough distractions to keep his mind off of work at the end of a day.
As Virgil Thompson once said, if I'm going to starve to death, I'd like to starve to death where the food is good. And Paris is a wonderful place to live. It's the most beautiful city in the world. It's easygoing. Every corner, every cafe reeks of romance, and not just by association. It's a nice place to starve to death or to be poor with other young people.
High unemployment in France barred foreigners from any local income. Expatriates often depended on overseas family support or the unpredictable sales of their art to survive. Hemingway planned his routes carefully to resist temptation. The best place to go was the Luxembourg Gardens, where you saw and smelled nothing to eat, he wrote. Through the gardens to the Musée Luxembourg, he went to view the Manets, Monets, and Cézannes. I learned to understand Cézanne much better and to see truly how he made landscapes when I was hungry, Hemingway wrote. I used to wonder if he were hungry too when he painted.
When you are 25 and are a natural heavyweight, missing a meal makes you very hungry. But it also sharpens all of your perceptions, and I found that many of the people I wrote about had very strong appetites and a great taste and desire for food, and most of them were looking forward to having a drink.
Paris offered ample opportunity to do so. In the evening, artists waited for the last of the light, and their café crèmes would be replaced by vermouth, absinthe, and brandy. Tables were set up outside of the cafés, and the locals of Montparnasse flocked to them as the evening began.
It's a very lonely business, writing. Well, most people can't write for more than a couple of hours, and they've got to go out and find out how other writers are doing, which I think leads to the sort of the café life.
At the cafes, Hemingway joined others who had finished a day's work for better or worse. He recalled that there were models who had worked and there were painters who had worked until the light was gone. There were drinkers and characters, some of whom I knew and some that were only decoration.
You find this cafe society, and by that I mean a world where people don't go home to eat. People don't go home to have private lives. Their private lives are public lives. They are in permanent circulation from cafe to cafe to cafe.
Whether it was at the Dôme, the Du Magot, or the Brasserie Lippe, the artists of Montparnasse gathered to discuss the pressing issues of the era. Man Ray could debate surrealism over Dada with André Breton. Aaron Copland might discuss the music of Les Six with Virgil Thompson. Or Ernest Hemingway argue with John Dos Passos over the Select versus the Dingo Bar.
It was like having a salon. You could receive people, say hello, arrange to meet, give each other rendezvous for certain hours. So it was all very congenial and very sociable.
Hemingway initially hated the bohemia of cafe life. The scum of Greenwich Village, New York has been skimmed off and deposited in large ladles, he wrote upon arrival. You can find anything you are looking for at the Rotund, except serious artists.
There were lots of them, the hangers-on, the people who pretended to be great writers. To most of the lost generation, foremost among them was a writer named Robert McCalman, about whom Archibald MacLeish wrote the couplet, "I'd rather have to eat dead salmon than spend an evening with Robert McCalman."
Though Hemingway included McCalman on his list of worthless characters, he was not above meeting him for drinks at the Dingo. McCalman had an interest in publishing Hemingway's work and was often good for picking up the bar tab.
I think the other thing was that there was prohibition in America, and so writers liked to drink a lot, and at least writers in that period certainly did.
In Montparnasse, the jockey became an overnight sensation with the Americans. Partygoers came out of limos and onto a dance floor so crowded that one patron said he saw a pretty young girl dance completely nude while no one else noticed. Hemingway noticed another woman, only partially so.
This is the heat of July. She was dancing in a mink coat with a British soldier in uniform. Ernest saw this gorgeous ebony-colored woman, cut in on her to dance with her. And that was Josephine Baker. And that's how they met. And toward the end of that evening, when they were ready to leave the dance floor, he said, "Tell me, Josephine, why are you wearing that mink coat?" And she said, "Well, a girl has to wear something." And she opened the coat up, and she was naked.
Paris was the home of Le Nègre Revue, where Josephine Baker entranced the city with her unique performance style. Black American jazz permeated the nightclubs of Paris in the 1920s. Among the most popular was Le Select, a club that offered dancing and entertainment until dawn. And for the artists who staggered out of the club doors into daylight, there were café crèmes to shake off the night and start another day's work at the cafe.
Everybody who writes is interested in living inside themselves in order to tell what is inside themselves. That is why writers have to have two countries, the one where they belong and the one in which they live, really.
One always thinks of Paris and you think of these people all sort of getting together at Sylvia Beach's or bookstore or somewhere, that they met in cafes and sat around and talked as a type of collective. And MacLeish said that wasn't true at all, that they were all self-absorbed with what they were doing.
In his lonely hours at the Bibliothèque Nationale, Archibald MacLeish became well acquainted with the solitude his poetry required.
He spent 3 years writing nothing in Paris, but reading everything he could, reading in English as far as he could without getting back to Beowulf.
MacLeish was following Ezra Pound's advice to Americans serious about writing poetry, to know European literary tradition inside and out.
They weren't satisfied with just being themselves and knowing who they were. They needed to know what had gone before. And so you had people like Archibald MacLeish learning how to write poetry by reading Dante in a library in Paris.
And then starting to write very carefully in his own style, so that although he lived and obviously was influenced by all this, what came out in most poems was something that was Archie, not Paris.
In his poem entitled Family Group, MacLeish began to reconcile his brother's death.
After the armistice, I mean the floods, the weeks without a word. That foundered farmyard is in Belgium somewhere. The faceless figure on its back, the helmet buckled, wears what look like navy wings. A lengthened shadow falls across the muck about its feet.
They felt, in a sense, that if they immersed themselves in these old civilizations and at the same time partook of this energy and excitement that was happening in Paris with modernist painting and modernist music and modernist literature all starting to bubble, that they would really go somewhere with it.
American poet E.E. Cummings, also living in Paris, was inspired by the freedoms of Dada to invent a new system of punctuation, while Hemingway scoured the Old Testament for material. Over café au laits at the Closerie des Lilas, Hemingway would quote his finds to Dos Passos. "One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh. The sun also riseth, and the sun goeth down." Living off the royalties of his wartime novel, Three Soldiers, John Dos Passos traveled in and out of Paris throughout the 1920s. Malcolm Cowley remembered him as the greatest traveler in a generation of ambulant writers. When he appeared in Paris, he was always on his way to Spain or Russia or Istanbul or the Syrian desert. The ever-traveling Dos Passos restrained his writing to a single American city, fitting his increasingly radical politics and belief in the common man into the scope of his novel, Manhattan Transfer.
There are flags on all the flagpoles up Fifth Avenue. In the shrill wind of history, the great flags flap and tug at their lashings on the creaking gold knob poles up Fifth Avenue. Paris has always been home of all foreign artists. They are friendly, the French. They surround you with a civilized atmosphere, and they leave you, inside of you, completely to yourself.
I never met an American who wasn't, in Paris, busy with American plans and purposes and material, remembered McLeish.
People brought their own worlds with them. This is what's interesting about the American writers in Paris. They're not writing about Paris. They're writing about the Michigan woods.
Hemingway drew his short stories from experiences at home. His boyhood trips to Lake Walloon in Michigan became those of his character Nick Adams. And his bitter homecoming to Oak Park became the story of Krebs in A Soldier's Home.
Paris has served writers in different ways. Sometimes it's just a place to go and get drunk and make merry and meet each other. Sometimes as a place to learn about French literary trends and incorporate them into English. And sometimes as a place to get a perspective on America.
The climate helped them. Everything that was happening. In the evening, they would all go to the Select. And they'd all sit around big tables, and they would enjoy their dinners together. They would go off to Pamplona together as a group. They went to Schrun skiing together as a group. They became a cohesive, producing organism. And out of it came some of the works that we still feel are masterpieces today.
Within the circles of these authors, each influenced the other in both literature and life. A skiing trip with Hemingway inspired an exhilarated Archibald McLeish to write pages of prose on his new sport. After reading them, Hemingway remarked, "Never write about anything you don't know all about." In the warmer climates of Spain, Hemingway and Dos Passos shared their sense of adventure by running with the bulls. In an equally dramatic event, James Joyce recited his manuscript of Finnegan's Wake over white wine with the McLeishes and Sylvia Beach. Other nights, Joyce simply accompanied McLeish's wife, Ada, on the piano.
He used to come over and play Ada's piano and teach her these wonderful Irish songs. I mean, the Brown and the Yellow Ale and all of these great songs, and they'd sing together.
But all of that was part of work, too. It was a deepening of their ideas, a strengthening of their concepts about what they were doing. They got a better sense of who they were and what they were after by what some people might think of as socializing, but which was really a kind of collective groping for the way.
One of the really great satisfactions of that period in Paris was that personal competition practically didn't exist, remembered McLeish. What you were doing was to compete against the art itself. Pushing through on their literary journey, the writers of the lost generation began to find their way.
They also think of themselves as a common voice. There's a we that begins to emerge out of this ragtag band of expatriates.
Lost? Lost. I consider myself one of the discovering generations. Like Hemingway, like Cummings, like Fitzgerald. They all came out of France, you know, all of them.
On Gertrude Stein's recommendation, Hemingway declined to submit his short story, Up in Michigan, to any American publications. The story was good, Stein remarked, but the sexual explicitness made it unprintable. Instead, Hemingway sent stories he equally believed in, like A Soldier's Home.
I knew the stories were good, and someone would publish them finally at home. When I stopped doing newspaper work, I was sure the stories were going to be published, but every one I sent out came back.
His story of the shell-shocked war hero was returned by Harper's Magazine, along with a now familiar rejection letter.
And Ernest said at times it hurt him so badly that he would throw things against the wall, break down crying. And I said, I never think of you as crying. And he said, let me tell you, man, when the hurt's bad enough, you cry. I never cried from a wound, but I certainly cried when those stories that I really believed in came back to me in the slot in the door.
Stein had been well suited to give Hemingway advice regarding unprintable manuscripts. The bulk of her writing, including an epic novel, The Making of Americans, lay in her studio in Rue de Fleur without having been to press.
She was totally convinced in her own importance and wrote volume after volume without finding a publisher for them.
In the case of 3 Lives and Geography and Plays, Stein arranged to pay for publication herself, and the rise of the independent press gave Stein's experimental writings a natural outlet.
There were other young people there who were interested in starting up small presses. You could publish there. You could take chances there. There was very little censorship there.
Seasoned writers and developing talent equally depended on Harold Loeb's Broom, Robert McCalman's Contact, and a host of small presses for recognition. If the little magazines died to make free verse, as Stein put it, most died young after wealthy patrons lost interest in their literary stints. But despite short lifespans, poor quality paper, and no profit, the little magazines got the work out. After 13 years, Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans finally made it from the Rue de Fleur to the Transatlantic Review. With no censorship, the magazines often published even what Stein viewed as unprintable. Up in Michigan would have its first run with the literary elite as McCalman printed Hemingway's 3 Stories and 10 Poems.
When Hemingway arrived and started writing this very lean, muscular prose, this vernacular kind of writing that was unknown in French prose or even in American or English prose at the time, it was terribly exciting.
With the series of vignettes entitled In Our Time, Hemingway received a much-needed boost from influential critic Edmund Wilson. In his review for The Dial, Wilson stated that Hemingway's little book has more artistic dignity than any other that has been written by an American about the period of the war. Wilson keyed a friend from Princeton into the young new talent as well. "He's the real thing," responded F. Scott Fitzgerald to his editor at Scribner's and Sons. "I'd look him up right away."
He cabled his editor, Maxwell Perkins, and brought to his attention this young writer whom he misspelled as, with two M's, as Hemingway, H-E-M-M-I-N-G. And that was the making of literary history.
Hemingway had little idea he was being scouted for the venerable publishing firm when the man who looked like a boy walked into the Dingo Bar.
He had very wavy hair and a high forehead, excited and friendly eyes, and a delicate, long-lipped Irish mouth that, on a girl, would have been the mouth of a beauty. The mouth worried you until you knew him, and then it worried you more.
Fitzgerald, by the time he was in his early 20s, was already a success. He was a best-selling author with This Side of Paradise, which was published in 1920, and he was not yet 24 years old.
This Side of Paradise transformed the boyish Princeton graduate into the chronicler of the Jazz Age. Fitzgerald was an overnight American success, and along with his glamorous wife Zelda, embodied the life of the Roaring '20s. But the life of celebrity, weekend parties in Long Island, and bootleg gin grew tiresome to the Fitzgeralds. They were going to the old world to find a new rhythm to their lives. In his new home of Paris, Fitzgerald's celebrity and reputation as a popular writer held little credibility among the avant-garde of Hemingway's left bank.
There must have been extraordinary envy from these struggling, so-called serious experimental writers in Paris at the time, and tendency to dismiss him as a popularizer and not, therefore, a serious writer.
Though he would sit with Hemingway trying to enjoy himself at the cafes, Montparnasse was never Fitzgerald's style. While earnest work as a serious artist made him the darling of the left bank, Scott's indulgence befitted a playboy of the right bank.
It's the place of beautiful avenues, dazzling hotel lobbies, of gold and white and red carpets. And it's that image of Paris, I think, that oftentimes shows up as the background of Fitzgerald's work.
Fitzgerald could also afford the difference in price between a drink at the glamorous Ritz bar and the careless Closerie des Lilas.
Fitzgerald came to Europe with a big checkbook, big bank account, and very established commissions for writing for the Saturday Evening Post. We must remember, they paid him $5,000 per short story. That is the equivalent today of a writer being paid $50,000 to $70,000 per story, which is probably something that he could knock off in a day, if it was a good, sober day.
That was a rarity. The Fitzgeralds had been known to go on 4-day drinking binges among the bars of the right bank, the cafes of the left bank, and the cabaret clubs of Montmartre.
Fitzgerald described the first full summer that he spent in Paris as being a season of 1,000 parties and no work. And that's unfortunately what happened to him while he was there.
In the midst of the revelry, Fitzgerald had gotten little work done in Paris. As Hemingway wrote him, "Paris is poisonous for you."
Hemingway may have partied as hard as Fitzgerald, may have gone out to the cafes late at night and stayed up much too late and had much too much to drink, just the way Fitzgerald did. But Hemingway, when it came to being a writer, was enormously disciplined. And Fitzgerald, I think, didn't have that real discipline.
Fitzgerald decided to accept an invitation to move to the south of France. There he hoped to regain the elusive discipline he'd found during the early stages of writing his novel, The Great Gatsby. Perhaps his luck would fare better on the Riviera. just a real place to rough it and escape from all the world, Fitzgerald wrote of the French Riviera.
And you have to understand that in this period, the Riviera was not a place that if you were French or fashionable, you ever went in the summertime. The only people who were around there in the summertime were the peasants and the fishermen.
In the secluded beach town of Valescure in the south of France, Fitzgerald completed the final drafts of The Great Gatsby. His work persevered in the face of an affair between his wife Zelda and a French aviator. His faith in marriage shattered, Fitzgerald was drawn to the second most influential woman from his years in France, Sarah Murphy.
A young woman lay under a roof of umbrellas, making out a list of things from a book open on the sand. Her bathing suit was pulled off her shoulder, and her back, a ruddy orange-brown set off by a string of creamy pearls, shone in the sun. Her face was hard and lovely and pitiful.
Fitzgerald was as entranced by Sarah's Irish beauty and her fierce intelligence as Pablo Picasso had been before him. Bred as a Manhattan sophisticate, cosmopolitan Sarah Weiberg abandoned the life of her parents by marrying Gerald Murphy, an intense Yale graduate who preferred the art of living over running his father's luxury goods emporium. Gerald had the good sense to dismiss the schoolboy attractions of Fitzgerald as sentimental disturbances. Gerald Murphy treated life with such a sense of style that Picasso remarked, "There is American elegance."
His complexion was reddish and weather-burned. So was his short hair. His eyes were of a bright, hard blue. His voice, with some faint Irish melody running through it, wooed the world.
Gerald had a transformation when he arrived in Paris in 1921. He saw in a gallery window paintings of Picasso and Braque and Léger and Juan Gris, and he decided that was what he wanted to do with his life.
"If that's painting," he told Sarah, "that's the kind of painting that I would like to do." Devoting himself to his art, Gerald's works were soon exhibited alongside those of the painters who intensely inspired him.
He became suddenly very, very famous. He was lionized by Picasso and Léger, both of whom became his friends, because they thought he was an astonishing, exciting, new artist.
Fernand Léger found Murphy's art as affecting as his style, declaring him the only American painter in France.
John Dos Passos once said that after he'd taken a walk with Gerald through Paris, that he would never look at anything in the street the same way again because of the way Gerald made him see things. In a sense, his whole life was his art.
Accommodating Dos Passos' wish to know more about ballet, Gerald handed him a brush as they painted the sets for Igor Stravinsky's new production.
They were friends with Stravinsky and Picasso and Léger and Diaghilev and the whole lineup of the Parisian avant-garde. And they provided a kind of a meeting place for the Europeans and the Americans, a way for the Americans to really get a dose of what it was they were coming to Europe to find.
Through the Murphys, Archibald MacLeish could discuss art with Fernand Léger or prose with Jean Cocteau, while his wife, deep in study over the songs of Erik Satie, could get pointers from the composer himself. As Ada MacLeish wrote, "The Gerald Murphys, whom we like enormously, live near us, so we really haven't a want."
Gerald and Sarah Murphy's friends always referred to them as a golden couple. They lived always as if they were inventing some wonderful game, and to be in their orbit, I think, for people like Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Archibald MacLeish and the other American expatriates who were living in France at the time was a really exciting experience.
"For me, only the invented part of life is satisfying," declared Gerald Murphy. At their home named the Villa America in Cap d'Antibes, the Murphys invented a grand life for those who joined them. One could get away with more on the summer Riviera, and whatever happened seemed to have something to do with art, remembered Fitzgerald.
These two knew how to create art out of conversation and out of the pleasures of eating. Eating by moonlight, eating new potatoes with dill and butter and drinking white wine, and that's your supper under a linden tree. Now that's pretty good.
They would go to the beach before lunch and spend an hour or two, as Fitzgerald describes it in Tenderest the Night, sort of sunbathing and swimming and playing games with their friends.
The man with the jockey cap was now going from umbrella to umbrella, carrying a bottle and little glasses in his hands. Presently, he and his friends grew livelier and closer together, and now they were all under a single assemblage of umbrellas.
Much to the liking of shy and soft-spoken Dos Passos, the Murphys were most fond of intimate gatherings of friends, sparing no expense in having champagne and caviar flown in from the Caspian Sea. The Fitzgeralds were usually fond of any Murphy occasion.
We frequently find Scott in the south of France. One time, he and Zelda took everybody's shoes and purses and attempted to boil them while the party was going on. I think in part because they felt then if they did that, nobody would leave. The party should last forever, I think was their idea.
To be included in Dick Diver's world for a while was a remarkable experience.
Sarah Murphy was asked late in her life what it was that had made Paris in the south of France in the 20s such a wonderful, exciting place. And she said, it wasn't the parties that made it such a gay time. It was, you loved your friends and you wanted to see them every day, and usually you did see them every day. And it was like a great fair, and everybody was so young.
By the summer of 1925, all Hemingway had to show for his 4 years in Paris were short stories. His first attempt at a novel, a wartime tale between a nurse and a wounded soldier, had evaporated. His wife Hadley had lost the entire manuscript on a train. Hemingway determined that he needed the disciplined writing of short stories in order to mature the lyric facility of boyhood that had plagued his unfinished novel.
Hemingway would agonize over his manuscripts, make corrections, scribble things out, rewrite, rework over and over again until he got it just the way he wanted to.
Short stories like A Soldier's Home had only come about after countless attempts and failures. He felt those like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who changed their stories for the slick magazines, hoard their talent, and were in danger of destroying it. But when he finished reading The Great Gatsby, Hemingway knew he had read a masterpiece.
Fitzgerald wrote the quintessential American novel, the novel about the American dream of the 20th century.
The Great Gatsby affirmed the next step for Hemingway. He had to write a novel.
I did not know how I would ever write anything as long as a novel. It often took me a full morning of work to write a whole paragraph. When I had to write it, then it would be the only thing to do, and there would be no choice.
A month later, Hemingway and his wife Hadley vacationed with friends at the Festival of San Fermin in Pamplona. In a week-long fiesta, the expatriates danced until dawn in the streets. They ran with the bulls and watched death in the ring. There was sexual intrigue between Harold Loeb, Lady Duff Twisden, and a jealous Hemingway. There was name-calling and drunken fights at the cafes. The festival was a splendid vacation for Hemingway. It had given him material. Within 2 months, Hemingway would finish the first draft of his first novel. If he could write a book as fine as The Great Gatsby, wrote Hemingway, I was sure he could write an even better one. Fitzgerald had equal expectations of his upcoming novel. It will be about myself. Moreover, it will have the most amazing form ever invented. In the south of France, Fitzgerald was planning his follow-up novel to Gatsby. The names of the characters and nature of the story would change in the course of his writing. But he centered his novel around a wealthy American couple living in the Riviera. Upon his return to Paris in September, Fitzgerald had little to show for his effort.
Scott and Zelda had been in Cap d'Antibes, and that fall, when I saw him in Paris, he was very changed. He had not done any sobering up on the Riviera, and he was drunk now in the daytime as well as nights.
The year after Gatsby had not been productive for the 28-year-old Fitzgerald. He recorded 1926 as a year of drink, loafing, plus the Murphys. Zelda had been little help to his lack of discipline.
He had a wife who was a constant distraction. In a way, he had a wife who was jealous of his success as a writer, and that was perhaps the most devastating thing of all. Zelda wanted to be everything her husband was.
Zelda looked at him, and she smiled happily with her eyes, and her mouth, too, as he drank the wine. I learned to know that smile very well. It meant that she knew Scott would not be able to write.
The flamboyant lifestyle was financially catching up with the Fitzgeralds.
He wrote in his mid-20s an article for one of these magazines called How to Live on $36,000 a Year, which recounted his rather boisterous life with his wife Zelda.
His money would be lost on all-night excursions on drinks, meals, and generous tips. He remembered 1,000-franc notes given to an orchestra for playing a single number, 100-franc notes tossed to a doorman for calling a cab.
Though The Great Gatsby had been critically hailed, commercially, the novel had poor sales, a quarter of what Fitzgerald expected them to be. A needed raise in Fitzgerald's salary from the Saturday Evening Post brought more short stories and further interruptions to his novel about the Riviera. Zelda remarked the novel went so slowly it ought to be serialized in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Following his ill-fated break to write for Hollywood came a series of nervous attacks. The stoppies, as Fitzgerald called them, prevented any serious work for 1927. In 1928, the year Scott went to a Parisian jail twice for drunkenness, he wrote, "The novel was like a dream, daily farther and farther away."
I think Fitzgerald was able to work fairly well in Paris until he began to drink so much that it kept him from working at all.
After a year of being unable to write even the short stories, he wrote to Hemingway, "I have worked 2 months on a popular short story that was foredoomed to being torn up when completed." In a P.S., Scott wrote, "The Post now pays the old whore $4,000 a screw." Hemingway replied in frustration, "Oh hell, you have more stuff than anyone, and you certainly care more about it, and for Christ's sake, just keep on and go through with it now, and don't please write anything else until it's finished."
My father felt that Fitzgerald had thrown away something that was magical, that he had one of the really, really great talents, and that unfortunately it was wasted.
If Fitzgerald had written nothing abroad, he would have still made perhaps the greatest contribution to our publishing house that anyone has made, and that is to introduce us to Ernest Hemingway.
When Scribner's published Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises in 1926, the New York Times praised Hemingway's lean, hard prose, that put more conventional English to shame.
Europe was really the making of Ernest Hemingway.
In his 5 years in Paris, Hemingway transformed himself from an eager hopeful to a world-class novelist. Elevating the lives of the expatriates into a masterpiece, Hemingway opened his last novel, A Movable Feast, with a fitting quote from Gertrude Stein: "You are all a lost generation." The life of celebrity followed Ernest Hemingway along the left bank, with hopeful young Americans emulating his success and his style. New arrivals from the Midwest molded themselves into Hemingway heroes, taking trips as he had done to the fiestas of Spain. With The Sun Also Rises, Ernest Hemingway had reached the pinnacle of his years in Paris. Published alongside it was a comedic novelette entitled The Torrents of Spring, a scathing parody of Sherwood Anderson.
It was not a kind thing to do to Sherwood Anderson. And Scribner's published it. And it may be the least of my father's works.
The Torrents of Spring was a public mocking of the man who first introduced him to literary Paris and Gertrude Stein. Hemingway anticipated Stein's anger. He had attacked someone that was part of her apparatus.
Later on, the relationship became soured. She started telling everybody sort of publicly that he learned everything about writing that he ever learned from her, and that, without her, he would never have been a writer.
Stein's printed rebuttal to Hemingway came in the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. The memoir of her years in Paris gave Stein a celebrity shared, as one critic put it, only by gangsters, baseball players, and movie stars.
The last time Sherwood was in Paris, they often talked about him. The two of them had formed Hemingway, and they were both a little proud and a little ashamed of the work of their minds.
With his newfound literary celebrity, Hemingway had outgrown his life at the Closerie des Lilas. Often, Fitzgerald would sit at the cafe alone, thinking of Hemingway and the promises from better times.
On one of these evenings, he and the Murphys had gone out to dinner, and he'd had too much to drink. And at one point, they all got up to leave the table, and Fitzgerald just sank to his knees on the floor and flung his arms around Gerald and said, "Don't go, don't leave me here all alone."
I was silent for too long after Gadsby, and Ernest's vogue succeeded mine, wrote Fitzgerald. It was not only the public that had forgotten Fitzgerald. Scott discovered that his best friends had abandoned him too, including Hemingway. With full confidence in his craft, Hemingway completed the wartime novel he had originally set out to write. When A Farewell to Arms was published in 1929, Hemingway secured his rank as a literary heavyweight. No longer the struggling artist of the cafes, Hemingway found that Paris had changed, as he had. The artistic fervor which had been the life of Paris in the early 20s was now turning to frenzy. Waves of Americans ready to join the celebrated expatriates heightened what Fitzgerald called a widespread neurosis as the decade ended. He witnessed that with each new shipment of Americans spewed up by the boom, the quality fell off, until toward the end there was something sinister about the crazy boatloads. October 29, 1929 would change Paris again. The American Stock Exchange had crashed.
The crash of 1929 ended all of this because they were no longer getting their remittance checks from home. And so the Americans were the hardest hit, the earliest hit, and they were the ones who had to slink home because they couldn't work in France.
In one day, the whole thing seemed to collapse. The whole house that had been built and that everybody had inhabited was a house of cards that had come down on them.
But you had people like the McLeishes decide, we'll go back to America. We really want to be in America. You had Ernest Hemingway and his new wife, Pauline, returning to America. You had Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald going back. And then you had the Murphys resisting returning to America.
Tragedy would end the Murphys' carefree life in the south of France. In 1929, they moved to Switzerland in a failed attempt to cure their son of tuberculosis. Gerald shut down the Villa America. He would never paint again. Life itself has stepped in now, he wrote Fitzgerald.
Gerald Murphy said that for him, only the invented part of life was satisfying and had any real scheme, any beauty, and that life blundered in and destroyed it. And I think that's what happened to everybody in that era.
From his country farm in Massachusetts, Archibald MacLeish wrote Gerald Murphy a poem entitled American Letter, asking, how can a wise man have two countries? MacLeish longed for Paris, but knew that despite the great heritage of Europe, his duty was to the promise of America.
This is our land. This is our people. This that is neither a land nor a race. We must reap, the wind here in the grass, for our soul's harvest.
Gerald and Sarah Murphy would finally sail to America, joining a generation of friends and exiles who had returned home. Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas were among the few who remained in Paris.
And what do they bring back? They bring back a sense of culture. They bring back a sense of a new way of looking at tradition, a new way of virtually inventing what literature is about. They come back with a new language. They come back with a fresh way of speaking. This is the spare language that Stein helps Hemingway refine. But they also come back with subjects. They come back writing about gritty lives in American cities, a fresh sense of urbanism. They come back to a sense of writing that's tuned in to the music that's being generated, the jazz. And the fact that they have to go to Paris in order to do that is terrifically ironic. These people have to leave America in order to, how shall I say it, for at least cultural, literary purposes, in order to invent America.
In Exile's Return, his biography of the lost generation, Malcolm Cowley recalled the end of the journey that had taken him and his classmates from ambulance drivers to international authors.
The lost generation had ceased to deserve its name. The members of it had either gone under or else had found their places in the world.
Those who succeeded created a body of American literature that ranked with that of European masters. The inspiration they had sought was found in Paris.
There is never any ending to Paris, and the memory of each person who has lived in it differs from that of any other. We always returned to it, no matter who we were, or how it was changed, or with what difficulties or ease it could be reached. Paris was always worth it, and you received return for whatever you brought to it. But this is how Paris was in the early days, when we were very poor and very happy.
Many of the lost generation's most celebrated writers lived their later years in misery. Ezra Pound was tried for treason after the Second World War, then spent years in a hospital for the criminally insane. Hemingway was diagnosed with depression and treated with electroshock therapy. In 1961, he killed himself. And after years of prodigious drinking, F. Scott Fitzgerald died of a heart attack at age 44. Before his death, Fitzgerald looked back on those Paris years with nostalgia and the realization that there was no going back. "The golden bowl is broken," he wrote to Gerald Murphy, "but it was golden."
For the web's best bios, log on to biography.com.